The phone rang at 4:12 in the morning. Not a gentle buzz. A hard, sharp ring that sliced through the silence of the East Wing office like something that refused to be ignored. The aide on duty, a 31-year-old career civil servant named Harrison Cole, grabbed the receiver before the second ring finished. His hand was steady. His face was not. He listened for 11 seconds without saying a word. Then he said, "I will confirm," and hung up. He reached for a second phone immediately, the internal line, and dialed a number that most people inside Buckingham Palace had memorized but hoped they would never need before sunrise. It connected on the first ring. The voice on the other end was not groggy, not startled. It was the voice of a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for moments exactly like this. Controlled, unhurried, carrying the full weight of an institution that had survived wars, divorces, public humiliations, and the long, slow pressure of a world that no longer simply believed in kings. King Charles III said one word, "Confirmed?" Harrison Cole answered, "Yes, sir. The verification came through 12 minutes ago. The audit team has the documentation in hand." Silence followed. Not panic, not rage, the specific, deliberate silence of a man deciding in real time exactly how much of what he feels he will allow to show. The king said, 7 o'clock, full advisory, everyone in the room. The line went dead. Hi, viewers. Before this story goes any further, drop a comment right now and tell me this. Do you believe that people inside royal circles actually leak information on purpose? Or do you think it always happens by accident? I want to know what you think. Harrison Cole set the receiver down. He pulled a yellow legal pad from the desk drawer and wrote one line at the top. Verified, internal, 412. He underlined it twice. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the window that faced the quiet London street below. Nothing moved outside. The city was still asleep. Black cabs sat cold at the curb. A single street lamp threw orange light across wet pavement. London looked exactly the way it always looked at this hour. Untouched, indifferent, completely unaware. But inside these walls, the temperature had already shifted. The document Harrison Cole had just confirmed was not a tabloid tip. It was not a rumor dressed up in careful language. It was the output of a private digital forensics audit. 11 days of quiet, methodical work conducted by a 3-person team brought into the palace under non-disclosure terms so tight that most senior staff did not know the review was even happening. Its purpose was singular: trace the pattern of internal information that kept finding its way outside. Quietly, precisely, repeatedly. And the pattern had a shape now. Shapes always point somewhere. At 5:47 in the morning, a black car pulled up to a side entrance. A man named Dr. Elliot Marsh stepped out, 63 years old, silver-haired, carrying a leather briefcase that had accompanied him through 4 decades of constitutional advisory work for the Crown. He did not announce himself at the door. He did not need to. The door opened before he reached it. By 6:18, 2 more cars had arrived. As Senior Communications Director Adrian Wakefield stepped out first. Dark coat, gray suit, hair pulled back, face locked into the practiced neutral expression that comes from years of managing information in conditions where one wrong word becomes a headline by noon. Behind her came legal strategist Marcus Trent, who was carrying not 1 briefcase but 2. 2 briefcases. Nobody in that room missed what that meant. No pleasantries were exchanged, no coffee offered. Just a nod from Harrison Cole, and then 4 people moving together down a corridor that most of the world had never seen and never would. Plain walls, institutional carpet, the kind of hallway that means absolutely nothing to anyone who does not know what waits at its end. What waited at its end this morning was a sealed brown folder, stamped with 2 classification marks. It is sitting flat in the center of the conference table, as if it had been placed there hours ago by someone who understood the weight of what it contained. The document did not need a dramatic title. It was labeled only with a case reference number and a date. But what it laid out, in the flat, factual language of forensic digital analysis, was a pattern so precise and so consistently directional that coincidence could no longer carry it. Someone had been tracking the palace's internal timing, not stealing from it, not hacking it, tracking it, reading its rhythm, anticipating its moves, and then feeding that rhythm carefully, indirectly, deniably, into external media channels that knew exactly how to use it. For weeks, stories had surfaced with a precision that should not have been possible. Scheduling adjustments discussed in rooms of 4 people had appeared reflected in public commentary within 24 to 48 hours. Security posture decisions, not classified but operationally sensitive, had been referenced in outside publications before any internal announcement was made. Narrative framing for upcoming royal engagements had appeared in media analysis pieces worded too specifically, too accurately, to be the product of educated guessing. Individually, each instance was explainable. Together, they were a map. And maps have origins. At 7:02 in the morning, King Charles III walked into the briefing room. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, looked at the folder, and then looked at every person already seated. Harrison Cole, Dr. Elliot Marsh, Adrian Wakefield, Marcus Trent, and 2 additional advisors who had slipped in quietly before the hour. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He asked one question. Is this coincidence or coordination? No one answered immediately. Not because they lacked an answer, because the answer carried the kind of weight that once spoken aloud in a room like this cannot be walked back. Dr. Elliot Marsh opened the folder to page 3. A single chart. 11 media timing incidents mapped against 11 corresponding internal planning events. He placed one finger on it and said nothing. He did not need to. The king studied it for a long time. Then he straightened, clasped his hands behind his back, and said 2 words that ended the briefing and started something else entirely. Find it. The room shifted. Legal pads opened. Voices dropped low. The quiet, deliberate machinery of institutional response engaged. Not with alarm, not with visible anger, but with the kind of cold, focused purpose that only activates when the people in a room understand that what they are protecting is larger than any of them. Outside, London had fully woken up. Morning traffic moved, coffee shops opened. The city reached for its ordinary day, completely unaware that 6 floors above its streets, a decision had just been made that would quietly reshape the way the most closely watched institution on Earth controlled its own story. But here is what that morning briefing still had not answered. The audit had confirmed the pattern. It had mapped the timing. It had traced the proximity, 2 external media networks, both deniable on their own, as both historically adjacent to royal figures who no longer carried working titles, but who had never fully stepped out of reach. The map existed. The name, the specific point of contact, the moment where internal became external, had not yet been confirmed. And that one missing piece was the thing nobody in that room was willing to say aloud, because naming it would force a choice between 2 conclusions. Either someone inside these walls had made a deliberate decision, or someone outside them had never really left. Which one do you think it is? Drop your answer below, because what gets confirmed next will make your gut drop. Stay with me. The folder was still open on the table when Adrian Wakefield's phone vibrated. She did not look at it. Not immediately. Because the room had not yet cleared, and inside Buckingham Palace, there is an unspoken rule that has nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with survival. You do not check your personal device when the king is still standing at the head of the table. You wait. You hold still. You let the moment finish on its own terms. But the phone vibrated a second time, and then a third. Adrienne Wakefield had worked in institutional communications for 19 years. She had managed press fallout from royal health scares, navigated the optics of legal proceedings that the palace would never officially acknowledge, and once spent 36 hours straight managing the narrative around a story that never ran. Because she made sure it never ran. She did not rattle easily. Her jaw tightened anyway. The king had already left the room. His 2 words, "Find it," still sat in the air like something physical. Dr. Elliot Marsh was gathering his papers. Marcus Trent was already on a quiet call in the corner, his back turned, one hand pressed flat against the wall the way people do when the conversation they are having is not one they want anyone else to lip read. Adrienne finally looked at her phone. 3 messages, same source. A contact saved under a name that was not the person's real name, a practice she had started years ago, long before the current climate made it feel necessary. The messages said 7 words total. It already moved. They know it moved. She read it twice, turned the phone face down on the table, and then sat completely still for 4 seconds in a way that Harrison Cole, who was still in the room and paying attention to everything, would later describe as the stillest he had ever seen a person be while their mind was clearly running at full speed. What had moved was not a person. It was a story. Specifically, a single piece of information. One scheduling detail that had been discussed inside the palace exactly 18 hours earlier, in a room of 5 people, under the assumption of complete confidentiality, had surfaced that morning in the comment thread of a mid-level royal commentary account with 400,000 followers. Not as a headline, not as a breaking news alert, as a passing remark. A throwaway line dropped with the casual confidence of someone who already knew the answer before the question had been asked publicly. 18 hours. That was the gap between the internal conversation and the external appearance. 18 hours was not a coincidence. 18 hours was a schedule. Harrison Cole confirmed it at 8:44 in the morning, cross-referencing the post timestamp against the internal meeting log he had pulled from the secure records system. He wrote the number down on his legal pad, circled it, and said nothing out loud. He did not need to. The circle said enough. The cybersecurity team lead, a woman named Dr. Camille Reyes, 38 years old, recruited from a private intelligence firm 18 months earlier specifically because she had a reputation for finding exactly the kind of signal that hid inside noise, was reached by secure line at 9:07. She had already seen the post. She had already begun the trace. Her first words were not reassuring. "This one is different," she said. The others went through 2 layers before they reached the surface. This one went through 1. Someone shortened the chain. Harrison Cole asked what that meant in plain language. Dr. Camille Reyes said, "It means whoever is moving this information is either getting more confident or more careless. And in my experience, those 2 things usually happen at the same time for the same reason." Harrison Cole asked what the reason was. She said, "Because they think the window is closing, and they are trying to get everything out before it does." By 10:15, Marcus Trent had divided his 2 briefcases into 3 working categories on the conference table. Each category was labeled with a colored tab: red, yellow, white. Red was legal exposure, actions that, if taken publicly, could be challenged in court or interpreted as targeted retaliation against specific individuals. Yellow was strategic risk, actions that were legally defensible but carried reputational cost, either to the institution or to individuals within its orbit. White was clean, options that could be executed inside existing advisory framework without triggering external scrutiny. The white category had 2 items in it. The red category had 9. Marcus Trent did not need to explain what that ratio meant. Everyone in the room understood that when the clean options are outnumbered 4-1 by the dangerous ones, the institution is not operating from a position of strength. It is operating from a position of damage control. And damage control at this level has a specific feeling, not panic, not disorder, but a very particular kind of controlled pressure, like a room where the air pressure is slightly off and every person in it can feel it in their chest without being able to name exactly why. Adrienne Wakefield stood at the window with her arms crossed, not looking at the street below, but clearly not looking at the room either. She was in the space between those 2 things. The place where people go when they are running a calculation that they have not yet decided to share. She turned around. "We have a timing problem," she said, "Ed. Not a legal problem. Not yet. A timing problem. Because if this story reaches a second platform before we move, the narrative resets. It stops being about a pattern and starts being about a response. And once it becomes about a response, we lose control of the framing. Permanently. The room was quiet. As Marcus Trent capped his pen, Dr. Elliot Marsh, who had said very little since the morning briefing, set both hands flat on the table and said, "Then we do not respond. We recalibrate. Quietly, structurally, and before the end of this week. No press, no announcement, no acknowledgement that anything unusual has occurred." Adrienne Wakefield looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "And the two names?" Nobody in the room said the names out loud, but every person in that room was thinking the same two names. Had been thinking them since 4:12 in the morning. Would keep thinking them until the answer came back confirmed, because unconfirmed, those names were just proximity, just pattern, just the kind of circumstantial alignment that defense lawyers eat for breakfast. Confirmed, they were something else entirely. "Doctor," Elliot Marsh said, "we wait for Dr. Reyes." The trace came back at 2:33 in the afternoon. Not a full report. A preliminary finding. 4 pages, single-spaced, written in the clipped, precise language of someone who has spent years learning how to say something devastating without raising their voice. Harrison Cole read it first. He read it in the corridor outside the conference room, standing alone under a light that flickered once and then held. He read all 4 pages without moving. Then he went back to page 2 and read one specific paragraph a second time. Then he walked back into the conference room, set the pages down in the center of the table, and looked at the 3 people waiting for him. He said, "The chain didn't shorten by accident." He said, "Someone removed a layer deliberately, and the layer they removed connects directly to a communication channel that has been inactive for 14 months. He paused. "Until 6 days ago." The room did not erupt. It did not fill with noise or movement or the kind of visible reaction that dramatic moments are supposed to produce. Instead, it did the thing that truly serious rooms do when truly serious information lands inside them. It went very, very quiet. Because a channel that had been inactive for 14 months, a channel connected to figures who had publicly distanced themselves from the institution, had reactivated exactly 6 days before the audit crossed its threshold. That was not carelessness. That was timing. And timing, in a room full of people who had spent their careers reading the difference between coincidence and intention, meant only one thing. Someone had known the window was closing, and they had made one final move before it shut. What that move was, and whose hand was behind it, was not yet written on any page in that room. But Dr. Camille Reyes had flagged one additional detail at the bottom of page 4. A single line, almost casual in its placement, the way the most important sentence in any document always seems to be the one that almost gets missed. It read, "Secondary channel cross-reference yields one overlapping contact. Identity pending verification. Recommend immediate escalation. One overlapping contact. One person who appeared in the data from both inactive channels. One name that, once confirmed, would collapse the distance between pattern and proof, and the king had not yet been told." Dr. Camille Reyes walked into the building at 3:47 in the afternoon carrying nothing. No briefcase, no folder, no legal pad tucked under her arm the way the others always arrived. Weighted down with documents, with categories, with the physical evidence of how seriously they took themselves. She walked in with both hands free and a look on her face that Harrison Cole would later describe as the expression of someone who had already decided what they were going to say and was simply waiting for the right room to say it in. She did not wait to be seated. She stood at the end of the conference table, looked at the 4 people already in the room and said, "The second name came back confirmed 22 minutes ago. I needed to deliver this in person." The room did not move. She said, "You are going to want to read page 3 before I say anything else." Harrison Cole slid the document across to Dr. Elliot Marsh first, not because protocol required it, but because in the 9 months he had worked alongside these people, he had learned that Elliot Marsh was the one whose face told the truth before his words did. If what was on page 3 was as serious as Dr. Camille Reyes's expression suggested, Harrison Cole wanted to watch Elliot Marsh read it. Because a man who had guided the crown through 40 years of threshold moments did not rattle without reason. Elliot Marsh read page 3. He set the document down. He took off his reading glasses, folded them slowly, and placed them on the table in front of him. He did not speak for 8 seconds. That was the moment Harrison Cole understood that what was in that document was not just a pattern anymore. It was not a chart of timing incidents or a proximity map or a list of media accounts with overlapping followers. It was something with a specific shape, a specific direction, and a specific human being attached to it. The document laid it out without drama and without mercy, the way forensic analysis always does, in columns, in timestamps, in the flat language of digital evidence that does not care about feelings or history or the complexity of family. The reactivated channel, the one that had gone dark 14 months ago and come back to life exactly 6 days before the audit crossed its threshold, had been accessed from 2 separate devices. Since the first device was registered to a communications consultant based in Los Angeles whose client list, while not publicly available, had been partially reconstructed through billing records and public contract filings. 3 of those clients had direct documented ties to media organizations that had run stories falling inside the timing window the audit had identified. That was the first thread. The second device was registered to a private email routing service, the kind used by people who understand exactly how digital footprints work and have made a deliberate choice to complicate them. But complicating a footprint is not the same as erasing one. Dr. Camille Reyes had spent 11 days learning the rhythm of this particular channel. And rhythms, even deliberately complicated ones, have tells. Thus, the tell in this case was a content pattern, specific language, specific framing, the kind of phrasing that does not come from a communications consultant or a media intermediary. It comes from someone who has lived inside the institution. Someone who knows not just what the information means, but what it feels like from the inside. The weight of it, the texture of it, the way it lands differently when you have sat in the rooms where it was first spoken. That narrowed the field considerably. And then the overlap appeared. One contact appeared in the data from both channels. Not prominently, not obviously, the way the most important detail in any investigation always appears. Quietly, tucked between 2 louder pieces of information, easy to miss if you are not looking for it specifically. Dr. Camille Reyes had been looking for it specifically. The contact was not named in the document. The contact was referenced by a case identifier, a 2-letter code followed by 4 numbers. The standard practice for preliminary findings where identity had been established internally but not yet cleared for written confirmation. The 2-letter code was on page 3. Elliot Marsh knew what it stood for. His folded glasses on the table said everything his voice had not yet said. Adrienne Wakefield read the document next. She read it the way she read everything, quickly, efficiently, her eyes moving down the page with the practiced focus of someone who has learned to separate what matters from what only seems to matter. She reached page 3. Her eyes stopped. She went back up 2 lines, read those 2 lines again. Then she set the document on the table, pressed both palms flat against its surface, and looked at Dr. Camille Reyes. "Is the identifier confirmed independently?" she asked. "Or is this still single source?" Dr. Camille Reyes said, "It was single source at noon. It is not single source anymore." Adrienne Wakefield said, "How many sources?" Dr. Camille Reyes said, 3 independent data points, no shared origin, all pointing to the same identifier. In my field, 3 independent points with no shared origin is not a question anymore. It is an answer. The room absorbed that. Marcus Trent, who had been listening from the far end of the table without writing a single word on his legal pad, which for Marcus Trent was the equivalent of another person standing up and shouting, finally uncapped his pen. At it, he drew a single line down the center of the page in front of him. On the left side, he wrote 1 word, white. On the right side, he wrote 1 word, red. Then he looked at the room and said, "Because what we do next depends entirely on whether we are treating this as an institutional protection matter or a direct attribution matter. And those 2 paths do not intersect. Once we choose one, the other closes." The institutional protection path was clean by comparison. Tighten the access layers, reroute the communication channels, remove the identifier from any future advisory loops. Do it quietly, do it structurally, and never say the name publicly. The institution protects itself without ever acknowledging what it protected itself from. The individual involved either notices the distance and understands, or notices it and says something, which creates its own kind of confirmation. That was the white path. The direct attribution path was different in every way. It meant taking the 3 independent data points to a higher confirmation threshold. It meant formal documentation under advisory legal framework. It meant the identifier became a name in a signed record. And a name in a signed record at this level had consequences that did not stay inside these walls regardless of how carefully the walls were managed. That was the red path. Marcus Trent's pen hovered over the page. No one told him which side to write on. At 4:29 in the afternoon, Dr. Elliot Marsh spoke for the first time since he had set his glasses on the table. He did not address the room. He addressed Dr. Camille Reyes directly. What he said, the channel that reactivated 6 days ago, the timing, the 6 days specifically. He paused. Was that deliberate in relation to the audit, or was the audit's threshold crossing a coincidence of timing? Dr. Camille Reyes looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I spent 2 days trying to answer that question the other way. I could not. Elliot Marsh said, meaning? She said, meaning the reactivation did not cause the audit to trigger. The audit was already running, but the reactivation suggests that someone with proximity to the institution's internal calendar had reason to believe that a review was underway. Not confirmed knowledge, but reason to believe. The room went still again. Because that single distinction between confirmed knowledge and reason to believe was the difference between an insider leak and something considerably more structured. Something that required not just access to information, but access to the timing of reviews. Access to the internal schedule of the institution's own defensive operations. Harrison Cole said quietly, more to himself than to the room, they knew we were looking. Nobody corrected him. The document stayed on the table. The 2-letter identifier stayed on page 3. The name behind it stayed unspoken in a room where everyone now knew it and no one was willing to be the first to give it the permanence of sound. At 4:51 in the afternoon, a message was sent through the palace's secure internal system to one person. The message contained 4 words. As it said, "The king needs you." The person who received that message read it in a different city, in a different time zone, in a life that had been deliberately constructed to exist at a careful distance from the institution that had just sent the 4 words. That person read the message, set the phone down, and did not respond for 47 minutes. What happened during those 47 minutes, and what that silence meant to the people watching the read receipt on a secure screen inside Buckingham Palace, is the piece of this story that changes everything you think you understand about how far this had already gone. Because the silence was not confusion. It was not surprise. It was a decision being made in real time by someone who understood with complete clarity that responding to those 4 words meant stepping back into a story they had spent over a year trying to walk away from. And not responding meant something else. Something that Harrison Cole, staring at the unmoving read receipt on the secure screen, was beginning to understand with a cold, sinking certainty. Not responding meant they already knew what was coming. And they were choosing their next move carefully. The read receipt timestamp froze at 4:51 p.m. It did not change. It did not update. It sat on Harrison Cole's secure monitor like a held breath, the small, glowing confirmation that the message had been opened, read, and then deliberately, consciously, left without answer. 47 minutes had passed, then 50, then 54. Harrison Cole had stopped counting out loud, but he had not stopped watching. In the corner of the same room, Dr. Camille Reyes had her laptop open and both hands moving. Not frantically, but with the quiet, economical precision of someone who has trained herself to work faster when the pressure increases rather than slower. She was running a secondary cross-reference on the communication pattern from the reactivated channel, checking the metadata against a new variable she had not included in the first report. Geographic location data attached to the device access points. She had not told the room what she was looking for yet, but the way her jaw had tightened 40 minutes ago and had not relaxed since told Harrison Cole she had already found something. He did not ask. He waited. As that was the skill this job had built into him over 2 years. The ability to hold a question in his chest without letting it reach his face, without letting it change his posture or his breathing or the specific quality of stillness that serious rooms required from the people inside them. He waited. He watched the timestamp. He felt the weight of the unanswered message, the way you feel a storm that has not yet broken. In the pressure, in the air, in the way everything around you has gone just slightly too quiet. At 5:38 p.m., the timestamp changed. Not a response, not a reply, just a second read. The message had been opened again. Harrison Cole straightened in his chair. Adrienne Wakefield was not in the room when the second read registered. She was 2 floors up. It's inside a smaller office that most people at the palace knew existed, but few had reason to enter. A room used for what the institutional calendar listed simply as Strategic Communications Review, which was the polished, harmless-sounding name for the kind of conversation that could not be logged, could not be minuted, and could not later be retrieved through any formal records request. She was on the phone. The person on the other end of the call was a media attorney named Jonah Sterling, 51 years old, Washington, D.C. based, the kind of lawyer whose name appeared nowhere near the cases that mattered most to his clients precisely because that was the arrangement his clients paid for. He was not the palace's attorney. He was not on retainer for the crown. He was a private contact, as a professional relationship built over years on the understanding that certain conversations needed to happen between people who had no official reason to be speaking. Adrienne Wakefield said, "If a story moves before we complete the attribution process, what is our exposure window?" Jonah Sterling said, "Define moves." She said, "First platform, named source, partial documentation published without full context." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "You have between 6 and 9 hours from first publication before the framing locks in public perception. After that, any institutional response reads as reactive rather than authoritative. And reactive responses at this level do not recover, they compound." Adrienne Wakefield said, "And if we move first? Structurally? Not publicly." Jonah Sterling said, "Then you control the sequence, and controlling the sequence is the only form of control that actually holds." She ended the call. She stood at the window of the small room for exactly 90 seconds, looking at nothing in particular. Then she walked back downstairs. At 5:52 p.m., the response finally came. Not through the secure palace messaging system, not through any channel that Dr. Camille Reyes or Harrison Cole or anyone else in the building had been monitoring. It came through a personal email account. One not connected to any institutional server, not flagged in any of the audit's data points, and not previously associated with the identifier on page 3 of the preliminary report. A new channel. Opened for the first time at 5:52 p.m. on this specific day. Used to send exactly one message. Yet the message was brief. It did not contain a greeting. It did not contain an explanation. It contained 2 sentences, and those 2 sentences, when Harrison Cole read them 11 minutes later on a forwarded secure print from Dr. Camille Reyes, made him set the page down on the table and press the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment before he trusted himself to speak. The first sentence said, "I know what you found." The second sentence said, "Before you take this where you are planning to take it, there is something you do not have." The room that gathered at 6:14 p.m. was smaller than the morning briefing. 4 people instead of 7. Elliot Marsh, Adrienne Wakefield, Marcus Trent, and Harrison Cole. Dr. Camille Reyes remained at her workstation in the adjacent room, her door open, as close enough to hear everything and be heard in return. Marcus Trent read the 2 sentences aloud. He read them in the same flat, even tone he used for every piece of sensitive information. The practiced courtroom voice that strips emotion from language so that the people listening can process the content without being steered by the delivery. Then he set the page down and said, 2 interpretations. He held up one finger. The first interpretation is that this is a warning, a deliberate signal sent through a new, untraceable channel to communicate awareness of the investigation and create leverage. The goal would be to introduce uncertainty, to make us hesitate before completing the attribution process by suggesting that the picture we have is incomplete. He held up a second finger. Yeah, the second interpretation is that it is exactly what it says it is, that there is a piece of information we do not have, that the person who sent this message possesses that information, and that they are offering, implicitly, without saying so directly, to bring it forward under conditions they have not yet named. The room sat with both interpretations for a moment. Elliot Marsh said, "And the third interpretation?" Marcus Trent looked at him. Elliot Marsh said, "Both." The question of which interpretation was correct mattered enormously, not because the institution could not proceed without answering it, but because the wrong answer would determine the wrong response. And the wrong response, at this particular pressure point, with this particular set of names circling the edges of a formal attribution process, it would not just damage the investigation. It would give the story to someone else. Because the one constant in any institutional crisis, the thing that every advisor in that room understood from experience rather than theory, is that information does not stay still. It moves. It finds openings. It travels through the channels that are watched least carefully, through the relationships that seem most unlikely, through the moments when the people responsible for containing it are focused on the wrong direction. And right now, there were two directions to watch. The first was the reactivated channel and the identifier on page 3. The thread Dr. Camille Reyes was still pulling, still tightening, still working toward the kind of confirmation that would turn a 2-letter code into a name on a signed document. At the second direction was the new channel, the new email, the 2 sentences that had arrived at 5:52 p.m. from a source that had not existed in the morning and might not exist by morning. 2 directions, 4 people in the room, and a decision that needed to be made before the 6 to 9 hour window that Jonah Sterling had described on the phone with Adrian Wakefield began to close. Harrison Cole said, "We need to know what they think we don't have." Marcus Trent said, "Agreed. The question is whether we ask directly and confirm that the line is open, or whether we let it sit and watch what comes through unprompted." Adrian Wakefield said, "If we ask, we show our hand." Marcus Trent said, "If we wait, we give them time to construct the conditions." Elliot Marsh had not spoken for several minutes, yet he was sitting at the end of the table with both hands flat on the surface in front of him, and his eyes focused on a fixed point slightly above the opposite wall, the posture of a man running a very long calculation in a very short amount of time. He said, "There is a version of this where the message is not a warning and not an offer. There is a version where it is a test, where the person who sent it is not trying to create leverage or provide information. They are trying to determine how close we actually are. Because if we respond in a way that reveals the depth of what we know, they have their answer. And if we do not respond at all, that is also an answer." The room went quiet. Harrison Cole said, "So, every option is a tell." Elliot Marsh said, "Every option is a tell." At 7:03 p.m., King Charles III was briefed for the second time that day. He sat at the head of the table in a different room from the morning, smaller, more private, the kind of room that does not appear on any public tour of the palace and is referred to in internal scheduling simply by a room number. He sat with Elliot Marsh on his right and no one else in the room. Elliot Marsh walked him through the afternoon in sequence. The second read, "The new channel, the 2 sentences, the 3 interpretations, the 6 to 9 hour window, the tell problem." The king listened without interrupting. He had a specific way of listening that everyone who had ever briefed him privately had noticed, and no one had ever fully described, a quality of attention that was not passive and not aggressive, but somewhere in between. That's like a current running just beneath still water. When Elliot Marsh finished, the king said, "The something we do not have. What is your instinct?" Elliot Marsh said, "My instinct is that it is real." The king said, "Why?" Elliot Marsh said, because a person constructing leverage would have been more specific. They would have given just enough detail to be credible without giving the detail away. This message gave nothing. No specificity, no credential. Just a statement of awareness and a suggestion of incompleteness. That is not the structure of leverage. That is the structure of someone deciding, in real time, whether to step forward. The king was quiet for a moment. Then he said, someone who knows something we do not know and has not yet decided whether to give it to us. Elliot Marsh said, yes. The king said, then we make it easier for them to decide. He said it the way he said most things in private rooms. Quietly, without theater, with the weight of someone who has spent a lifetime learning the difference between what sounds decisive and what actually is. He did not elaborate. He did not explain the mechanism. He simply named the direction, the way a compass names north without describing the terrain between here and there. Elliot Marsh understood. He nodded once, and then he did something that Harrison Cole, waiting outside the room, watching the timestamp on the still unanswered original message, would not learn about until the following morning. He sent a reply. Not to the new channel. And not to the reactivated channel from the audit. To a third address. One that appeared nowhere in the data. One that Dr. Camille Reyes had not flagged, had not traced, and had not included in any report, because it was not part of the investigation. It was part of something older than the investigation. Something that had existed long before the audit. Long before the pattern was mapped. Long before the brown folder was placed on the center of the conference table at 7:02 in the morning. The reply contained one sentence, and the person who received it read it within 4 minutes. What that sentence said, and who received it, is the piece of this story that reframes everything that came before it. Because the investigation that began with a phone call at 4:12 in the morning was not the only thing running inside these walls. It never had been. And the thread that Elliot Marsh had just pulled was not attached to the audit at all. It was attached to something the king had set in motion long before anyone in that conference room had ever heard the words, pattern recognition threshold exceeded. The question was no longer who had moved the information. The question was how long the king had already known. Do not move away from this channel, because what happens next is where the oldest thread in this entire story pulls tight. The person on the other end of Elliot Marsh's reply makes a choice that nobody in that building expected. And the king's next move reveals just how far ahead of this investigation he has been from the very beginning. If this story is landing with you, subscribe right now, turn on your notifications, and share it with someone who needs to see how power really works when the cameras are off. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters here, and this community is built on people who think, question, and refuse to accept the surface version of any story. The reply that Elliot Marsh had sent the night before arrived in a city 7 time zones away. It landed at 2:17 in the morning, local time, on a phone sitting screen up on a kitchen counter in a house that sat at the end of a private road with no street sign and no number on the gate, but the house was modest for the life its occupant had once lived. Clean lines, careful landscaping, the kind of restrained elegance that announces itself without trying to. As the kind of home chosen by someone who no longer wanted to be found easily but had not yet fully decided whether that was permanent. The phone lit up. A woman named Serena Voss picked it up from the counter without sitting down. She read the message standing in the kitchen in the dark. With the refrigerator hum the only sound in the house and the blue light of the screen the only light in the room. She read it once. She set the phone face down on the counter. She stood there for a long moment with both hands pressed flat against the cold surface. Her eyes focused on the middle distance, the way a person stands when their body has stopped moving because their mind has hit something it cannot move around easily. Then she picked the phone back up and read it again. The message from Elliot Marsh contained one sentence. As it said, "The thing you know that we do not, it is time." 6 words, no signature, no case reference number, no institutional language, no legal framing, no careful diplomatic phrasing of the kind that characterized every other communication that had moved through palace channels in the past 24 hours. Just 6 words written by a 63-year-old man who had known Serena Voss for 11 years and understood, with the precision that comes from a long career of reading people in high-pressure rooms, exactly which 6 words would reach her when nothing longer would. Serena Voss had worked inside the orbit of the British Royal Institution for 6 years before she left. Not as a working member, not as staff in the conventional sense, as a private consultant, the kind of role that exists in the space between official and unofficial, between documented and deniable, between the version of events that gets written down and the version that actually drives decisions. She had been good at it, exceptionally good. The kind of good that makes an institution want to keep you close and, eventually, makes the same institution realize that keeping you close carries its own specific category of risk. She had left quietly. 14 months ago. No announcement, no public statement, no tell-all interview. Just a gradual withdrawal, a series of handoffs, and then an absence that the people paying close enough attention would have noticed and the people who were not paying attention would never think to ask about. She had built the distance deliberately. She had also, in the process of building it, kept something. Not stolen, not misappropriated, not taken in any way that a lawyer could turn into a charge or an institution could turn into a weapon. She had kept it the way a person keeps a piece of information that they hope they will never need to use, held carefully, privately, stored in the place in the mind where things go that are too significant to forget and too dangerous to speak. She had kept it because she understood, even at the moment she acquired it, that the day might come when it was the only thing standing between the truth and the version of the truth that powerful people preferred. She had been waiting for 14 months to find out which kind of day today was. At 6:44 in the morning London time, as Harrison Cole arrived at his desk to find a single item waiting in the secure system inbox. Not from Dr. Camille Reyes, not from Marcus Trent, not from any of the addresses, channels, or identifiers that had populated the investigation's communication landscape over the past 48 hours. From Elliot Marsh. The item was not a document. It was not a report or a preliminary finding or a legal category memo. It was a calendar entry. A single meeting, scheduled for 11 a.m. that same morning, listed under the room number of the small private office that appeared on no public tour of the palace. Attendees listed: Marsh, Cole, no other names, no subject line, just the room, just the time, just the 2 of them. Harrison Cole sat at his desk for a moment. He looked at the calendar entry. He looked at the timestamp of when it had been created, 3:04 a.m. London time, which meant Elliot Marsh had scheduled the meeting in the middle of the night, less than an hour after sending the 6-word message to Serena Voss in a house 7 time zones away. He had not slept. Whatever response had come back fast. And it had been significant enough to keep a 63-year-old man awake through the early hours of the morning, scheduling meetings and sitting with information that he had chosen deliberately not to share through the secure system. Harrison Cole opened his legal pad. He wrote the time, 6:44, at the top of a fresh page. He underlined it once. Then he sat back and waited for 11 a.m., the way a person waits for something they already know is going to change the shape of the day. The meeting began at 11:03. Elliot Marsh was already in the room when Harrison Cole arrived. Seated at the small table with a single printed page in front of him, and both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and had made peace with it. Not haggard, not worn down, but carrying the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep but from sustained, uninterrupted thinking. He did not offer pleasantries. He said, "Close the door." Harrison Cole closed the door and sat down across from him. Elliot Marsh slid the printed page across the table. Harrison Cole looked at it. It was not a document in the formal sense. It was a transcription, a plain text record of a message exchange, printed from a personal device rather than the secure system. The kind of thing that would not appear in any official record because it had never passed through any official channel. The exchange was between Elliot Marsh and Serena Voss. It was 6 messages long. Harrison Cole read it from the beginning, slowly, and did not speak until he had finished all 6. Then he went back to message 4, the one from Serena Voss, and read it a second time. Message 4 said, "What I have connects both names to a third. The third name is the one that makes everything else make sense. It is not a media contact. It is not a consultant. It is someone who has been inside the institution's trust framework for the past 2 years and has used that position specifically to ensure that the attribution trail always pointed away from the center and toward the edges. I have the communication record. I have the timestamps. I have 4 months of documentation that your audit did not find because it was never stored in any channel your audit had authority to access. I kept it because I knew this day would come. I am prepared to give it to you, but I need to know that what I give you goes directly to the king and nowhere else first." Harrison Cole set the page down. He looked at Elliot Marsh. He said, "A third name." Elliot Marsh said, "A third name." Harrison Cole said, "Someone inside the trust framework." Elliot Marsh said, "Someone who has had full advisory access for the past 2 years. Someone who would have known the audit was being considered before it was formally authorized. Someone who would have had every reason and every means to ensure that the pattern, when it was eventually found, was pointed in a direction that protected the center and exposed only the periphery." Harrison Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The 2 names on page 3 of Camille's report." Elliot Marsh said, "Were never the source." Harrison Cole said, "They were the cover." Elliot Marsh said nothing. He did not need to. The implication of what Serena Voss had described in message 4 was not abstract. It was structural. It meant that the pattern the audit had identified, the 11 timing incidents, the reactivated channel, the 2-letter identifier that the entire investigation had been building toward, was not the leak itself. It was the managed version of the leak. The version that had been deliberately shaped and positioned by someone operating from inside the institution's own trust framework, using their access and their knowledge of the audit's limitations to ensure that when the investigation reached its conclusion, it reached the wrong one. It was not a cover-up in the conventional sense. It was more precise than that. It was a redirection. A carefully constructed trail of digital breadcrumbs that led investigators to 2 names. Names that were adjacent enough to be credible, controversial enough to be believable, and distanced enough from the center to absorb the consequence without threatening the person who had actually been moving the information. And Serena Voss had 4 months of documentation proving it. 4 months of records that had never passed through any channel the audit could access because the person she was describing had known, from the inside, exactly which channels were being watched. As Harrison Cole said, "How long has she had this?" Elliot Marsh said, "She began keeping records 10 months ago. She had suspected it for 4 months before that. She did not come forward because she needed to be certain. And because coming forward without certainty, against someone operating at this level of access, would not have produced an investigation. It would have produced a dismissal." Harrison Cole said, "And now she is certain." Elliot Marsh said, "She is certain. And she is ready." At 1:15 in the afternoon, Elliot Marsh walked into the small private room with the number instead of the name and briefed King Charles III for the 3rd time in 2 days. He laid out the 6-message exchange. He laid out Serena Voss's offer. He laid out the implication of the 3rd name, not the name itself, which Serena Voss had not yet given, which she was holding as the condition of the exchange, and he waited. The king sat with it for longer than he had sat with anything in the previous 48 hours. Then he said, "She wants the documentation to go directly to me." Elliot Marsh said, "Before anyone else sees it, yes." The king said, "She does not trust the process." Elliot Marsh said, "She does not trust a specific person inside the process." The king said, "The 3rd name." Elliot Marsh said, "Almost certainly." The room was very quiet. The king stood and walked to the window. The same movement, the same posture that Harrison Cole had described from the morning briefing, the specific physical grammar of a man taking the measure of something before he responds to it. He stood there for a moment. Outside, the city moved the way it always moved. Indifferent, as continuous, unaware. Then he turned back. He said, "Tell her yes, direct to me. No intermediate. No record in the system until it is in my hands." Elliot Marsh said, "There is one more condition." The king said, "Tell me." Elliot Marsh said, "She wants to deliver it in person, not digitally, not through any channel. She wants to be in the room." The king looked at him. He said, "Then she will be in the room." What Serena Voss was carrying across 7 time zones, what she had spent 10 months building into a record that could survive scrutiny, withstand legal challenge, and hold its shape under the specific pressure of institutional denial, was not just a document. It was a name that would not just redirect the investigation, it would rewrite the entire premise of it. And the person that name belonged to is at this precise moment still inside the building, still trusted, still in every room that mattered, still feeding information to a network that the audit had been carefully designed to miss. And they had absolutely no idea that a woman in a house at the end of a private road 7 time zones away had been quietly keeping count. Serena Voss landed at Heathrow at 6:22 in the morning. No one met her at the gate. No black car with tinted windows idling at the curb. No palace aide holding a sign with a name that was not her name. Nothing that would register on a camera. Nothing that would give a sharp-eyed journalist or a well-positioned photographer anything to attach a story to. She had traveled under her own name, on a commercial flight, us in a window seat in economy class, because the safest way to move something important from one place to another is to look exactly like someone who is not moving anything important at all. She collected one carry-on bag from the overhead compartment. She walked through arrivals. She took the train into the city. And she kept her left hand pressed flat against the outside of the bag the entire journey, not clutching it, not drawing attention to it,